This presentation is brought to you by the Beljanski Foundation. Over 50 years of research towards curing cancer the natural way.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Bojana Jankovic Weatherly, and I'm a board-certified internal medicine and integrative medicine physician. And today we're going to talk about the integrative approach to autoimmune thyroiditis or autoimmune thyroid condition called Hashimoto's thyroiditis. Now, I'd love to just see in the audience, how many healthcare professionals do we have in the audience? Okay, great. Perfect. So I'm going to start by asking you a few questions. How many of you think that stress is directly related to chronic disease? Please raise your hand. Okay, most of you. And how many of you think that the lifestyle habits that we choose, and we've heard a lot about this today, when it comes to food, when it comes to environmental toxins, including pesticides and other toxins, and our other habits, how many of you think that those are also directly related to our health and well-being? Please raise your hand. Good. And how many of you at times feel overwhelmed by the amount of information and even a lot of contradictory information that's out there, where you might think, I don't know where to start. This is really confusing. Yes. And obviously, you're in the right place. I can absolutely relate to all of these things. I'm going to share with you a story that relates to these things and also relates to how I came to practice integrative medicine. Starting as an internal medicine physician, I never in a million years thought that I would be practicing integrative and functional medicine. But there were a few reasons that happened during my medical training that kind of started to change my trajectory, and that ultimately shaped how I treat myself and how I treat my patients as well. So let's talk about stress, that first question, that toxin called stress. When I was in my internal medicine residency training, I was pregnant twice. I was crazy enough to listen to my OBGYN who we were having a discussion, and he said, look, Bojana, it's never the right time. You're always going to be busy and running around. It's like the Nike slogan, just do it. So I just did it. I had my kids, but it came at a price. For those of you that are healthcare professionals or that have somebody in the family or a close friend that's in the medical field, you probably know that being an internal medicine residency means working 30-hour shifts every 3 to 4 days, working 6 days a week, taking care of very, very sick patients, not having time to go to the bathroom or have a drink of water or grab some food. So when I was pregnant, I had to carry a bottle of water in the pocket of my white coat, and I had an apple and some almonds on hand to keep me hydrated and nourished. And although this helped somewhat, it certainly didn't help prevent the burnout and exhaustion that I felt from carrying my baby in pregnancy and running around and doing the thing that I love and taking care of really sick patients. And on top of this, both of my babies, in fact, but at that time that baby was measuring very big. One of them was over 10 pounds. So my OBGYN said, look, we've got to start talking about a C-section potentially, and that really was just my critical point. One night, I woke up in the middle of the night and I was sobbing and totally desperate, thinking, I don't know if I can do this. How can I do this? I was so burnt out and exhausted. And I was also really worried about the implications of this lifestyle, of this chronic exhaustion, of lack of sleep, poor nutrition, exposure to toxins, exposure to a great deal of stress, and how this was going to impact my baby and whether it was going to lead to some complications. So being the science nerd that I am, at 2 o'clock in the morning, I literally was online looking up all the research that I could find and trying to figure out, is there really a correlation of these long work hours and pregnancy complications? And unfortunately, there was. There was plenty of evidence. And this really was my first wake-up call. I thought I could choose to be a victim of my circumstances, or I could choose to be empowered and to take my health in my own hands. And so in that moment, staring at that computer screen at 2 o'clock in the morning, I made a commitment to my daughter Olivia and myself that I was going to achieve my highest level of health, that I was going to do everything possible to give us the best chance at health. And so I started working with a prenatal yoga instructor. I started working with a birth doula. I started working with an acupuncturist and chiropractor for the very first time to prepare my body for the birth of this huge baby. And as I started to practice these things, I noticed a shift. And it was a shift not just in my body and how I felt and being more energized, but also in my mindset. I was no longer exhausted. I was no longer burnt out. I was actually supporting my body to heal. And I think that we all have the ability to support our bodies and our minds to heal. We all have the ability, no matter what our health condition is, we all have the ability to live at our highest level of health, to take our health in our own hands. And so this is the road here that I'm pointing to. I don't know if there's a little pointer, but so definitely my road to integrative and functional medicine wasn't a linear one, as oftentimes in life, we kind of go in this circular path. We don't really know what's around the corner, but we follow what seems right. And then we reach the sunshine. So thankfully, I gave birth naturally to 2 healthy babies. And then 2 years later, I started practicing primary care. So I still wasn't really fully on board with the integrative. I was open to it, but I wasn't fully on board. And I started noticing that I was seeing a lot of patients who were suffering with chronic problems for a long time. And there were so many people who were on a number of medications, and there just wasn't, perhaps some of the symptoms were masked, but there wasn't either a clear diagnosis or there wasn't a clear resolution or a clear reversal of the problem, or looking into the root causes of what actually is causing these symptoms and how can we work with these root causes and triggers. And so I was seeing a lot of patients with anxiety, panic attacks, depression, thyroid problems, irritable bowel syndrome, other autoimmune diseases. And instead of getting overwhelmed, and instead of maybe adding more medications, I decided to take a step back and to get really curious. And so what I did is I decided I'm gonna do everything in my power to empower my patients the way that I was empowered by my practitioners when I was a pregnant resident, totally desperate and on the edge. And so we started talking about nutrition. We started talking about lifestyle habits such as mastering stress, sleep, movement. We started talking about having a community, a tribe, growth and purpose. I actually talked to my patients about growth and meaning and purpose in our visits. It's the best. I mean, it's so fascinating. I love hearing what makes people tick. What are they really excited about? This is part of your health. What makes them have joy? Do they spend time in nature? What do they do about the toxic burden? Antoinette mentioned earlier our exposure to glyphosate, plastics. We're surrounded by toxins. What do we do to eliminate those toxins or reduce? We talk about spirituality, self-care, and really combine the best of conventional evidence-based medicine with the integrative modalities that have evidence and that directly address the root causes of the symptoms. And what I found, not to my surprise, is that people actually started getting better. My patients started having more energy. Their gut symptoms improved. They stopped needing to take medications to prevent their panic attacks. And I thought, okay, there's something to this. So then I went on and I got my fellowship in integrative medicine and kind of did that whole thing to really educate myself on how I can best support my patients with all of these different foundations. And how can I really work within conventional and integrative and functional medicine to really bring the best to my patients. So now let's focus on the thyroid gland, right? We're talking about thyroid autoimmunity and specifically Hashimoto's thyroiditis. Let's first start with the basics. And don't let this diagram here overwhelm you. You can just ignore it. So thyroid is a butterfly-shaped gland at the base of our neck. It produces hormones that regulate our body's metabolism. They regulate our heart rate, our gut function, our nervous system, our mood, our brain. Thyroid gland relies on iodine to create these thyroid hormones. So iodine is transported in, it's combined with tyrosine, an amino acid, and then T4 and T3 are produced. And we're going to talk a little bit about the mechanics of this a little bit later. So why are we talking about hypothyroidism? Because there are many different causes of hypothyroidism. There's also hyperthyroidism, but today I really wanted to focus on hypo because it's very common. 12% of the US population develops some type of thyroid disease, and it's 5 to 8 times more common in women than in men. And the symptoms, as you might imagine, right, if the thyroid hormones control our metabolism and our gut, when our thyroid is underactive, people often get very tired. They gain weight. Some might get depressed. They have intolerance to cold. They may get constipated, feel really sluggish. They might have dry skin, hair loss, and so on. So these are the typical symptoms. And as you probably can tell from this, some of the symptoms are kind of vague. Like there are a lot of things that could cause fatigue, right? So sometimes it's hard to tell whether the symptoms are specifically because of thyroid dysfunction or if there's something else going on. So the next step when a patient presents with these problems, right? Normally we do thyroid function tests, which we'll talk about a little bit. And then in the typical conventional model, we next offer thyroid hormone replacement if somebody has overt hypothyroidism, an underactive thyroid gland. There are different combinations and different options, but really the gold standard is levothyroxine, which is that T4 that I talked about that's produced by the thyroid gland. However, up to 10% of the population that's treated with levothyroxine still has some symptoms of hypothyroidism on that one medication, even when the lab work is totally normal. There are different hypotheses as to why this might be once other causes have been ruled out of those symptoms. And we're not quite going to get into them other than to say that there might be up to 10% of the population that might do really well with combining the T4 and the T3 that I talked about earlier, and I'll mention it again. But for the most part, T4 is the standard therapy. And of course, in pregnancy, levothyroxine or that T4 should be taken only. So what are some of the factors that affect thyroid function? So again, this slide is kind of busy, but we'll just go ahead and break it down. So the way that the thyroid is regulated is by the thyroid stimulating hormone, that TSH up there, that is produced by the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland produces TSH, which then tells the thyroid to produce and release T4. Now that T4 goes down, and it can convert into T3, the most active form of thyroid hormone, the one that binds the end organs and causes all of those things. So digestion, heart, mood, nervous system, activities. Or T4 can convert into reverse T3. That's the inactive form, and it actually competitively binds the same receptor that T3 binds, meaning that it can negate the fact that T3 is there. Well, that's not a good thing. What are some of the things that can affect this dynamic of producing a nice, normal, healthy dose of T3? That's our active thyroid hormone. Well, one thing is nutrients. So when we think about certain nutrients, we think about iron, iodine, right? We talked about iodine being important in actually synthesizing and creating these hormones. We also think about zinc, selenium, and we think about a number of vitamins, vitamin E, B2, B3, B6, C, D. So what you can tell without, with just kind of focusing in on the main points in this slide is that nutrition is extremely important when it comes to thyroid health. Now, what else can deregulate this pathway towards a normal, nice, healthy level of T3, of the active thyroid hormone? Stress. So this stress can be in form of whether it's physical stress, whether it's another illness, whether it's actual mental stress, emotional stress. It could also be stress in form of a low-calorie diet. People who consume a very low-calorie diet may actually reduce the amount of this conversion from T4 to T3. So our body, and this is really the fascinating thing, our body has this incredible way of regulating every system. And when you think about stress, right, you think about, okay, well, I need to conserve energy. I'm under stress, so I need to conserve it. And that's exactly what thyroid is doing. It's saying, okay, you're under stress. Let's conserve the energy so that you can fight, you can cope with a stressor. So now let's talk about, we've now seen the mechanism of thyroid hormone production and what kind of things, the nutrients and the stressors that can actually affect how our thyroid hormone exerts its effect. What about hypothyroidism? Well, here we're going to focus on, there are many, as I mentioned, reasons for hypothyroidism, but we're really going to focus on this autoimmune, right? That's the theme today, the autoimmune. So what happens in hypothyroidism due to an autoimmune process, autoimmune thyroiditis, is that our lymphocytes, which is a type of white blood cells, they go into the thyroid and they start destroying the thyroid gland. Now, how does this immune system get activated? Well, it can get activated in a number of ways. Some of them we've already heard about today. We heard from Antoinette about the gut, about intestinal permeability, right? We get a leaky gut, we get more toxin exposure, and as a result, our immune system gets activated. So that's one. And we talked about gluten, we talked about glyphosate, we talked about the imbalance in our gut bacteria. So all of it, it's the same mechanism essentially. Infections can also activate our immune system. So that's one thing that's really important to look at as the root cause. It could be viral infections, such as the Epstein-Barr virus reactivation. It could be parasite infections. So a number of different infections can cause it. And then, as I mentioned, nutrients, right? Selenium is really important when it comes to regulating thyroid autoimmunity. So we talked about this, and then we talked about the leaky gut right here. And then the gluten connection. Now, we already heard a little bit about gluten, so I'm just going to very quickly go through a couple of studies before we end. So there was a study where they gave women with Hashimoto's thyroiditis, so autoimmune thyroiditis, a gluten-free diet for 6 months. And then they also had controls who didn't consume gluten-free diet. Those that consumed the gluten-free diet were able to reduce their thyroid antibodies, meaning their autoimmunity against the thyroid gland after those 6 months. There's also been a lot of interest in this autoimmune protocol diet, which unfortunately I don't have time to get into today, but I'd be more than happy to answer any questions afterwards and share more information. But essentially in this autoimmune protocol, we're eliminating possible foods that could be triggering the immune system. And again, there are some promising results from that as well in terms of lowered inflammation, but we need more studies to be done. Another study looking at people who eat more vegetables, dried fruit, nuts, and muesli, again, lower thyroid antibodies. And I was going to go through a case study, but we can kind of really wrap it up here. So what would the typical protocol be for somebody with autoimmune thyroiditis? Well, again, as I mentioned, we want to look at the diet, anti-inflammatory diet, really important. We want to look at and address any nutrient deficiencies, right? And so it's really important to work with a qualified healthcare practitioner to address that. We want to address intestinal permeability, leaky gut, reduce the toxic burden, and then treat any infections if they're present. And then, of course, address stress and sleep. because these play a very important role in the immune system. And then this is how we're going to start to see results in improved antibodies and improved immune picture. So we want to address the foundations of health. Remember that our body has this innate tendency to want to balance. So when we interpret labs and symptoms, we have to do it together and really look at the whole picture. And then it's really important to work with a qualified healthcare professional as well as a health coach, because there are a lot of dietary and other lifestyle modifications here. So it's important to work with someone who can offer that kind of support for sustainable, lifelong changes. Thank you.